Good afternoon, and welcome to Series 8 for the Safe and Welcoming Schools Professional Development Live Webinar Series. Today, we are so fortunate to have Dr. Tyrone Howard, a professor from the Graduate School of Education and Information Studies from UCLA here, to talk to us about equity in action. So at this time, I would like to introduce my colleague, Jewel Forbes, who will introduce our speaker for today. Jewel.
Thank you, Janice. Good afternoon, everyone. So now a little bit about our featured speaker. Dr. Tyrone C. Howard is the Pritzker Family Endowed Professor in the School of Education and Information Studies at UCLA. Dr. Howard is also the inaugural director of the UCLA Pritzker Center for Strengthening Children and Families, which is a transdisciplinary consortium of experts who examine academic, mental health, and social emotional experience and challenges for California's most vulnerable youth populations. His research addresses issues tied to race, culture, access, and educational opportunity for minoritized student populations. Professor Howard is the author of several best-selling books. He is a native of Compton, California, where he has also served as a classroom teacher. Professor Howard is a member of the National Academy of Education and has been listed by Education Week as one of the 30 most influential educational scholars in the nation on education practice, policy, and research. Welcome, Dr. Howard.
Thank you, Jewel. It is such an honor and a privilege for me to be here with you all today. I'm always honored to be in your presence, to be able to share my work, and I thank you all for continuing to invite me back. I also want to thank Janice Phelps, who is also part of this dream team of continuing to bring the really important issues to bear of how we can continue to be advocates for our young people in ways that I'm sure all of you who are on today. I'm always excited. I always feel like I've got a lot to cover and not enough time to cover it in, so I'm going to get straight to it, because I have so many topics I want to have us discuss today. Hopefully you can see that screen just fine. Let's talk equity in action today. I'm someone who was fortunate enough to be able to talk about these issues, write about these issues, think about these issues, and live through these issues. So this is a labor of love for me. It's a labor of love because we've got to get it right. We've got to do something different. We've got to be transformative, I believe, if we're going to help support all of our students. But especially if we want to support those who are most vulnerable. So let me jump in with a big thank you to each and every one of you who have joined on today. I'm in this attitude of gratitude. I always say that because the work of serving young people is never easy. But we know in the last 2 years that work has been incredibly challenging. So for those of you who continue to show up every day, who give your best, who sacrifice rest, sleep, you name it. Thank you for what you do. Thank you for investing in our young people. Thank you for investing in our future. I can't say how much we are grateful for your investment in other people's children. You make it all work. You connect the dots. You cross the T's. You dot the I's. You do all the things that oftentimes doesn't go recognized. I oftentimes say that it's so unfortunate that when we see young people not thriving, we are quick to say what educators aren't doing. But when young people are doing well, we say what great homes, what great parents they have. Can't have it both ways. I'm going to start flipping that script a little bit. I'm going to say we have great students because we have great educators who pour and who invest in them. And you all represent that. So thank you for what you do. I'm also going to say comment, follow, and tweet. Part of what we have to do is continue to build our community of advocates, of individuals who are fighting for what's in the best interest of our young people. You can follow me, follow Los Angeles County Office of Education, hashtag it with Justice Matters and Equity Matters, because that's what our topic and our focus will be on today, is issues tied to equity, issues tied to justice, so that we can support, help, and assist all of our students reach their fullest potential. I would be remiss if I didn't start today with just a very quick commentary for what we witnessed this week, I should say last week in Buffalo, New York. I just wanted to say that I think we had yet another ugly incident of senseless shootings that resulted in the deaths of people who should still be here with us today, and they're not. And The reason why this work is so important because we have to dedicate ourselves towards eradicating hate in whatever way, shape, or form possible. But I also want to double down on that. We have to fight towards eradicating anti-Blackness. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit later in my talk today. But I think when you look at what happened in Buffalo on Saturday, this was intentional. It was very direct. It was very explicit in its focus on harming Black people. And while we talk about the tragedy that Buffalo brought to lots and lots of families, I want us to be able to think about what we can do here in Los Angeles County to lift up and support Black families, Black children in particular. So I'm going to come back to this later, but I wanted to at least start off by saying that I hope all of your hearts and thoughts and prayers are out to the families of Buffalo who lost loved ones. And let's continue to hope that we don't continue to see these senseless acts of violence in our country. So I'm going to start you off today with one of my quotes from one of my favorite authors of all time, which is James Baldwin. And James Baldwin has an essay called A Talk to Teachers. That's one of my favorite essays of all time. And I think it's must reading for anyone in education. It's an essay I have all of my pre-service teachers read on the first day of class, because what Baldwin says is something I think is so important that I want us to use to kind of ground our conversation today around equity. Just to give a little bit of background and context about this essay that Baldwin writes, he writes it in 1962. And he's writing it at a time when there's deep division in the country. The country is at war or on the brink of war. The country is racially segregated. There are quests for civil rights across the country, this deep-seated divide between the haves and have-nots. And Baldwin writes this essay to teachers. And in this essay to teachers, he begins by saying, let's begin by saying that we are living through a very dangerous time. Everyone in this room is in one way or another aware of that situation. And what he goes on to say in this essay is that teachers have to make a decision about what they're going to do in this moment. And when you read Baldwin in 1962, you would think he was writing the same essay today if he were alive, because so many of the same issues that he raises in that essay 60 years ago are still prevalent today. Deep-seated inequality, racial strife, racial inequality. And he says, teachers, you really don't have an option of being neutral in this moment. And that's the same thing I would say if you're going to do equity in action. There is no neutrality. And what Baldwin says that you have to be prepared to, quote, go for broke, end quote. And I think that's what we have to think about if we're going to really do equity the right way. Are we prepared to, as Baldwin says, go for broke? We can continue to say we're going to do things business as usual, or we're going to have to stand back and stop and say, can we do something different? Should we do something different? We need to do something different. And that's what equity is all about. So much of this is about thinking about forward ways of how we do the work of supporting our young people. It's also about making sure that we're not doing the same things over and over again and expecting a different outcome. And I think as we do this work around equity, you need to make sure that if you do this work the right way, you must have thick skin. You know that people are going to talk about you. They're going to sort of undermine you. This is not for the faint of heart. Equity work is oftentimes full of loneliness because you are oftentimes the lone person speaking up and speaking out for justice. Equity work is sometimes so challenging because you feel like you're constantly fighting an uphill battle, but this is the work of justice. This is the work of doing what's right for our young people. So as you do this work, be prepared for all the naysayers, all the backbiting, all the underhandedness. You have to know that if you are doing this work hoping to be popular, that this is the wrong profession. If you did this work hoping that it would be expedient, this is not the right profession. But this is the work that's about long hours of digging and pushing and fighting for what's right for our young people. So as we do that, that means we have to have some serious conversations, some of which will start today, some of which I talk about in the video series. And in those difficult conversations, we have to know that at times we're going to say things that are going to ruffle feathers. But as I've said before, I'm okay because I think some feathers need to be ruffled. I think, you know, if you do this equity work, you're going to at times step on toes. But with that, again, I'm okay because there are some toes that need to be stepped on. This is about the work we have to do for our young people. So as we have these conversations, I still think it's important to have respectful, healthy dialogue, even when it gets contentious and even when it's disagreeable. And so I'm asking you all who are here, and you're probably here because I'm preaching to the choir, because you are probably the persons who are already raising these questions. pushing the envelope. When people see you coming, they think, oh, here she comes, or here he comes, or here they come. And they go the other way because they know you're going to raise the issues that need to be raised. You're going to say the things that need to be said. You're going to do the things that need to be done. So here's a little sort of tool I use when I have conversations with folks that I know sometimes can get contentious. I always say, if there's something I say that is upsetting or off-putting, or sometimes I have to catch myself because sometimes I might even say something that's disrespectful or unpleasant to some. But here's my key word: ouch. Ouch is the buzzword in these conversations that we use. So if someone says something that really doesn't sit well or doesn't go over well, that becomes our stopping point to say, okay, let's stop, let's reflect, let's listen, let's talk, see how we can come to better understanding, because that's our goal here. Our goal is to come to greater understanding, but frequently when we have these courageous conversations, we don't oftentimes have the courage to step in and tell folks that what you just said, I just deeply disagree with. Or we don't have the tool to say what you just said, I think was really borderline offensive. How many times have we sat in meetings and someone says something really, really inappropriate, and we all look around hoping, waiting for someone else to say something, and no one does? We have to start speaking up and speaking out. And it can't be the same actors who are speaking up and speaking out all the time. There are a lot of us who sit in these meetings who are quiet. There are a lot of us who sit in these meetings and we are indifferent. And I'm asking us, if we're going to do what Baldwin says around going for broke, we need to speak up. We need to say what we think is what's in the best interest of young people. And ouch becomes that word to become a bit of a sort of a pause point for as we have these conversations. So if I say something today that you find upsetting, you just drop that ouch in the chat, okay? Thank you so much. Now, let me be clear from the outset. I've said this a lot and I'm going to keep saying it because I hear people continue to use these terms interchangeably, but I operate from the framework that equity and equality are not the same thing, though people use them interchangeably. I frequently believe that equality is our goal. Equality is our destination. Equality is where we ultimately want to be, where everyone is seen and treated as equals. But the reality is we're not there. And so in many ways, equity is our pathway, or equity is our means to get us to equality. Let me be clear. Equity is the pathway, the means, the vehicle that will hopefully ultimately get us to equality. So I oftentimes say, we can't say, let's just do equality right now, because if we did equality right now, we still end up with inequality, because not everybody starts from the same place. Not everyone has the same opportunities. Not everyone has the same advantages. Not everyone has the same supports. And so why schools are so important and why educators are so critical, because you have to be the individuals who recognize who are those student groups who oftentimes start off at a significant disadvantage. We have to be bold and unapologetic if we're going to be advocates of equity, to say that we are okay, we are comfortable with giving more time, more attention, and more resources to those who historically have been denied. Now, when folks hear that, they think, well, Dr. Howard, you can't say that because that's not fair. You can't give more to some compared to others. And I say, well, that's what equity has to be about in some instances, because guess what? We're not playing the fair game when we talk about equity, because if we were playing the fair game, we'd have to acknowledge the fact that, guess what? Poverty, which many of our young people deal with every single day, is not fair. We have to recognize that racism, which many of our young people deal with every day, is not fair. We have to recognize that issues around homophobia and transphobia, with lots of our students deal with every single day, is not fair. So if we were talking about fairness, a lot of what our young people deal with, they would not have to deal with. So that's why we're not playing the fair game. We're trying to play the equity game as a means and as a mechanism to get to where we want to ultimately be, is all of us being treated with equal protection under the law, equal protection in classrooms, equal protection in schools. So let's be clear about when we raise these issues, the focus is on those who are disproportionately disadvantaged, either contemporarily or historically. So let's not use those two terms interchangeably. So let's go deeper on how we're operationalizing equity. I like to think about an understanding of equity that refers to a heightened focus on groups experiencing disproportionate impact. And our goal is to see how we can remediate disparities in their experiences and outcomes. That's twofold. So again, part of what we have to do if we're going to have real equity in action, we have to begin to talk about who are the groups of students in our schools who experience disproportionate impact. And we need to name them. And you all know who they are, because they're the same group of students no matter what school you go to across this county, across this state, dare I say it, across this country. They're typically kids who come from low-income backgrounds. They're typically immigrant students. They're typically students whose first language is not English. They're typically Black and brown students. They're typically students who have disabilities. They're typically students who have home life that pose different challenges. We know who the groups are, We need to start naming those groups, not feeling sorry for those groups, not pathologizing those groups, but recognizing the historical factors, the structural disadvantages that have worked and continue to work against those students. Some of you are in schools where all the students that you serve are in need of something different because they're 100% among those categories that I just named. So equity is about making sure that we recognize and understand that there are some situations and circumstances that have affected students and their families beyond their control that they continue to deal with the effects of today. So let's talk for a moment about what equity is and what equity is not. I would make the argument that one of the things that equity is a focused and a sustained and unending series of conversations from the top, starting with our leaders, around identifying who are the most disenfranchised, who are the most overlooked, who are the most underserved students in our schools, in our districts. Let's name them. Let's not use one-size-fits-all approaches. Let's be very intentional and targeted, because when we start to have these conversations, we have to make sure that they're data-driven, that they're focused, and we're looking at root cause analysis. What I mean by root cause analysis is, why are these students historically at the bottom of the academic continuum, right? And what are meaningful interventions? Frequently, we have interventions that we see that have worked. Why don't we continue to use those interventions, but recognize that we can't use a one-size-fits-all approach? What works for one group of students may not work for another. And we have to make sure that when we do those root cause analysis, we understand that if we're not careful, the root cause analysis in terms of the ideals and beliefs and the deficit notions of certain students that cause students to end up in the situation that they're in the first place, some of those same ideologies and same mindsets are in classrooms and schools today. So even as we're trying to become more equitable, we have to ask a fundamental question: who are some of the individuals who sit in classrooms with our students, and what do they think about kids who are poor? How do they think about kids who are Black or brown? Because in some ways, we are oftentimes trying to make progress, but we're being undermined daily by some of the people who just fundamentally don't have the best interests of our students at heart. And in every school I go to, you all know who those individuals are. At some point in time, we have to have the courageous conversation of asking this person, perhaps you need to think about if this is the work for you, because you can do significant harm with your beliefs around certain students. You can do significant harm with your low expectations of certain students. You do significant harm with the kind of deficit notions that you have around students constantly talking about what they don't have, what they can't do. We have to start the conversations and begin to identify who's part of the problem and who is part of the solution. Let me go one step further. What equity is not is what I hear in a lot of schools across this country. As a matter of fact, I heard it in the school just yesterday from a group of teachers. What equity is not is the blame game. And what frustrates me is with educators who frequently say, well, you know, the reason why these students don't do well is because they just aren't motivated. They're just not well behaved, or their parents don't care about education, or, you know, their communities are just nobody there who values hard work. These are the kinds of deficit notions I'm talking about that are devastating to our children, devastating to our communities. We cannot do equity if we're starting the conversation off with blaming the very people we're designed or dedicated to help, our students. I frequently say to educators, and I said this to one last night, well, you know what, the last time I checked, no one is forcing you to do this work. No one is demanding that you do this work. These are choices that we make as professionals. And if you're in this business to just consistently blame others and not take any accountability on where and how you can be better, then maybe this is not the work for you. So when you think about what blamers do, it's this victim mentality that I am so special that these kids should be just fortunate that I take time out to be in their school, or they should be so satisfied that I am choosing to work in this community, right? That's what got me into a heated exchange last night. I had a teacher who said, well, you know, these kids just don't understand what they're getting when I show up. And I said, well, please tell me, first of all, what do you mean by these kids? And what does it mean that you show up? What's the gift that you were given that's so valuable? So don't get me started. I said I was going to be low key and I was going to be composed today, but when I think about the things that people say when they're blaming, that becomes part of what the problem is, because you can't do equity work. You can't manifest equity in action if you have naysayers, right? I maintain we have to begin to identify those folks, try to find ways to get them on board, try to get them to understand where we're trying to go. And if they can move along with us, fine. If they can't, then maybe we have to ask them if this is the right work for them. The other thing we have to recognize, what equity is. Equity is about an intentional placement of additional resources, supports, personnel, and money into the schools, the districts, the subgroups, and programs that have historically been disadvantaged and are severely underserved. Now, again, this is where people oftentimes get a little bit upset. So Dr. Howard, you're saying we have to give some schools more money than others. I might say, yes, we should, because again, not all schools are created equal. And we have to be mindful of the fact that if you've got schools that have historically been in underserved communities where we've not invested, the kind of challenges that those students face, the challenges that their caregivers and parents face are severe. So therefore, we have to begin to find ways we can begin to offset some of those disadvantages. Are we going to eliminate poverty? Of course not. Are we going to eliminate inequality? Absolutely not. But if we can begin to be very intentional at the district level, at the county level, at the state level, to say, where are those schools that have high needs? What do I mean by that? There are schools right here in Los Angeles County where the levels of trauma are so intense and so high, yet those schools only have a single social worker, or maybe 2 social workers, or maybe 1 counselor. That is inexcusable to me, especially when you can go to other parts of the same county where you have affluent families and you have affluent children where they have a ratio of maybe 30 students to one counselor, 30 students to 1 therapist, 30 students to 1 social worker. So why is it that we have students who are dealing with more disadvantage, have fewer supports than those who come from more advantaged backgrounds? So what equity says is, why can't we have the same kinds of things that folks have in other parts of our county? Why can't we have a better student to counselor ratio so we're not one of the worst in the country, where we are now close to like 900 students to 1 counselor? Why can't we have psychiatric social workers in every school, especially high need schools where we know there's so much trauma and grief and loss that has been experienced, that our students have that? So it's about intentional placement of those resources where we know the need is greatest. That's what equity is. What else is equity not? Equity is not about resource hoarding. Let me say this one again. Equity is not about resource hoarding. I raise this because I continue to see where there are schools across our great county of Los Angeles where we have districts, parents, and in some cases, dare I say it, counselors and teachers who play the resource hoarding game. What does that mean? We're going to make sure that even in so-called integrated schools, we're going to make sure that even in so-called socioeconomically mixed schools, that some kids get opportunities that others don't. I see this happen in lots of schools in the Valley, where you have Black and brown parents who think that they're giving their young people a better education, yet the Black and brown children aren't told about the same kind of ways to take AP and honors classrooms. The Black and brown children or the low-income children are not told about the benefits of what dual enrollment is all about. The Black and brown children are not even having conversation with their counselors about how they can plan a 4-year plan so that they're college ready when the time comes to graduate. We have to make sure that as we put these supports in place, that we're not hoarding and only using certain opportunities for certain students. At the end of the day, I say this, and this is what equity is about. When those who are at the bottom of the academic continuum do better, we all win. I'm going to repeat that. When those who are at the bottom of the academic continuum, when they do better, everyone wins. This is not a zero-sum game argument where if poor kids do well, everybody else is going to suffer. If Black kids do well, white kids are going to be, out of sorts. If Latinx kids get opportunities, that means that these kids over here are going to be missing out. Let's stop playing this sort of, I've got mine, they have to figure out how to get theirs. If we're in this for all young people, and especially those who have historically been sort of overlooked, we have to sort of move away from this, how some kids are more deserving. I've seen school districts across this county where parents who know how to work the system, parents who know how to complain and who to complain to, get away with far more than they should. They get their kids in special programs, they get their kids with certain opportunities that other parents have no clue about. We've got to spread the wealth to make sure we're giving every student an opportunity to be successful. That's what's important to note, that what equity is not, okay? Let me also tell you what equity is not, and I'm gonna talk about this more in a few moments, but what equity is not is this focus on letting thousands, dare I say it might be even more than that, but tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of students right here in the state of California, and thousands here in the county of Los Angeles go to schools with disabilities to not have their needs met. And this is, to me, outright criminal, because there are legal precedents that speak to what we're supposed to give to students who have special needs. And it is, to me, outright criminal that we still see far too many young people, in particular, Black and brown, poor children, who are not having their needs being met. Students who are on the spectrum, students who have auditory hearing processing challenges, students who might have visual impairments, students who have different types of disorders that make a significant dent on their ability to be successful. We should not be treating students who have special needs as outsiders. We should not be treating them as individual students who don't have the ability to succeed. There's all kinds of data that we have on this, that when students who have special needs have the kind of supports, persistent supports that they are so deserving and that they are eligible for, that they can succeed at some of the highest levels possible. But what we have to do is make sure that we are all advocating for those students with special needs. So if you're going to talk about equity, let us not overlook those students with special needs who sit in classrooms every single day, not having their needs being met, who sit in schools where teachers and principals know that they need something different than what they're getting and they're not, or students who sit in classrooms who have IEPs and we're not adhering the particular requirements of the IEPs. That is an example of what equity is not. And when we see it, we have to have the courage to call it out and speak out against it so that doesn't happen to any student in our county, okay? What else? I have been on a one-person crusade to say it is important for us to talk about mental health. Jewel Forbes knows that this has been my calling card. She's been out there also being a champion for this work. Folks, we're going to talk equity. We need to also recognize the pervasiveness of the adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. We knew about the ACEs before the pandemic. We now know that during the pandemic, that young people who are experiencing adversity in many instances are experiencing more adversity. So I need you to understand what these different things do when it happens to young people. Many of you know it, you see it, you're familiar with it, but let's just take the first two: physical and emotional and sexual abuse. Now, part of what we have learned since the pandemic is that during the time of school closures, we saw a significant decrease. Some estimates put it at close to 60%. We saw a 60% decrease in the number of children who were reported for suspected abuse and neglect. Well, when you hear that, you think, well, that's a good thing. That means fewer children were being abused and neglected. But now we're learning, now we're understanding that that 60% decrease is not because there were fewer children being abused and neglected. The primary reason why there was such a big drop off in that number is because educators were not seeing young people. Educators were not seeing young people in person. And educators are one of the highest reporting sources of young people for suspected abuse and neglect in the county. So now we're also learning that in all actuality, we didn't see a decrease in physical, emotional, sexual abuse and neglect during the pandemic. In all actuality, we may have actually been seeing young people who experienced an increase in sexual abuse, neglect, physically and emotionally. So now what we're seeing are young people who are coming back to our schools and classrooms who have dealt with some of the most difficult circumstances that you would ever want to see a child suffer through. As someone who spends a lot of his time now looking at issues around foster care and children in need and children in the system, this is something that we all must take seriously. So we can't talk equity in action without having real hard conversations about mental health, about the ways in which even parents and caregivers who might have mental illnesses where they need additional supports, where we have to begin to look at the number of young people and their parents who might be suffering from some type of substance dependence. What we also know is that during the time of the school shutdown, that there was an increase in parental separation and divorce. And we've also learned, and we have data that tells us there's been an increase over the past 2 years around parental domestic violence. Just one of these factors would be enough to make it very difficult for a child to focus on school, just one. But the reality is we have students in our county, students in the schools that you sit in, schools that you serve and support that have 3 or 4 of these things. And so that's why we have to have this hard conversation about mental health, because if we don't have the conversation about mental health, if we somehow ignore it, or if we continue to let it be stigmatized, then in many ways we are complicit in allowing it to be the issue that it is. And I raise this because now we're seeing some data that shows that the number of young people who are having suicidal ideation has increased significantly. Anxiety and depression has increased significantly. And the Center for Disease Control put out a big report that came out in 2021 that talked about the young people who were experiencing high levels of depression. It's the reason why we have to stop making it so hard to talk about mental health. And I think one of the reasons why we have such a hard time talking about mental health is because we don't know how to talk about it. We're kind of we see social stigmas that apply to issues related to mental health. We are raised to believe that if you have a mental health challenge, that there's something wrong with you, or you're weak, or you're just not being strong enough. We have to pull off the mask. We are still living. Let me be clear here with this, folks. We are still living in the midst of a pandemic. All of us, present company included at some point in time, have had to deal with some mental health issues because we've had bouts of depression, anxiety, anger, sadness, grief, loss, you name it. And if that doesn't serve as a wake-up call for us to start having these conversations, I am not sure what is. We have to start making mental health a normal conversation. We need to give kids the permission to say that they're not okay. And I raise this again because, as I mentioned a moment ago, and some of you have heard me share these data, that the Center for Disease Control has talked about the number of young people who have sadly died by suicide over the past 2 years. And there are 4 groups in particular that have had a significant increase of 20% or more of death by suicide. And this is the equity conversation that we have to have. The group that's had the largest rates of suicide of young people over the past 2 years have been boys, ages 10 to 24. If we're going to talk equity, we need to also have a boy conversation. And I've said this, and I'm going to continue to say it, because so much of why we see boys right there is because we continue to live in the midst of what I call toxic masculinity, messages that we send to young boys saying that they can't feel, they can't hurt, they can't cry. Let's give boys the permission to feel. Let's tell boys it's okay to cry. Let's tell boys it's okay to vent and get their emotions out the best way that they know how. What we know, the data says that boys and girls have suicidal ideation at similar levels, but girls are more likely to talk to somebody, whereas boys are more likely to keep it inside. In many of our schools across this county, we have lots of our young boys who are walking around as ticking time bombs. Let's talk to boys. Let's tell boys it's okay to laugh, to be sad, to cry, to be angry. Whatever the human emotions that they want to express, it's okay. Let's support our boys. The next group are LGBTQ plus youth. Our LGBTQ plus youth, we know before the pandemic, were one of the groups that struggled mightily because in many ways, we still have not dealt with how we address homophobia and transphobia in our schools. But the reality is that for some of our LGBTQ plus youth, home is not the safest place to be. Home has been a place where they are oftentimes not understood. Home is a place where they're not affirmed. And in some very sad and unfortunate cases, home is a place where many may be abused. So we have to make sure that we are continuing to do our outreach and support for our LGBTQ plus youth, because if we don't, we will see these rates continue to spike. And then the last 2 groups are Black and Latinx students. And I raise that because of the fact that when we begin to look at over the last decade, we've seen these numbers climbing. And I think now it requires us to be a lot more intentional about what's happening with our Black and brown youth. But we have to tackle some very difficult cultural taboos, because in many aspects of the Black and brown community, we don't think that mental health issues are real. We don't think that mental health issues really exist. We don't think that mental health issues are something that require our time and attention. And that has to stop. We have to begin to think and talk about the ways in which we all suffer from depression at some point in time. We all suffer from sadness at some point in time. We have to recognize that it's okay to go to church or mass, and it's also okay to get help. We have to stop telling our young people to fight through it, to get over it. We have to tell our young people that it's okay to say, I'm just really in a bad space, and I'm not sure why. I think we have to stop the sort of the silence around mental health, because if we don't, again, that makes us very complicit in this. So let's begin to talk about mental health. We cannot have a real equity conversation if we're not talking mental health, because our failure to do so will only allow this issue to become a bigger and bigger challenge, okay? So I think a focused equity approach for special education, as I mentioned a moment ago, requires a special attention to our Black students, because the data continues to bear some of the things that are happening with Black students that are unacceptable. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. A big focus, if I can for a moment, on our English learners, because I talked earlier about the groups of students that we oftentimes have these deficit notions of. And one of the groups we have significant deficit notions of is our English learners, our language learners. And this is, to me, a real, I want to say not a civil right, it's a human right issue, because part of what we know, the number of young people who are coming to our schools whose first language is not English is only going to increase. What we also know is that far too many young people whose first language is not English are not in AP classes, are not in honors classes, are not in our gifted classes. So why that is troubling is because here's what we know. If you study the folks in linguistics, they tell us over and over again that people who are able to speak multiple languages, unlike me, have a certain degree of cognitive dexterity and cognitive sophistication that gives them sort of advantages and has sort of gifts that folks like me who speak one language don't have. So if you want to know who some of our gifted students are in our schools, they are English learners, our language learners, but yet we are oftentimes okay putting them in classes that they don't even need to be in the first place. Reclassification efforts oftentimes lag behind, and students sit in classrooms for years on end that they should not be in. It's like we lower the expectations, we don't provide the supports, and when these students don't do well, we wonder why, or we blame them. We've got to change our supports for how we begin to support our language learners, because they are one of the most ostracized and underserved student groups that are in our schools, and we have to do better if we're going to do equity in action in a meaningful way. I've talked about boys and what we need to do for our boys, but I also want to talk about students from low-income backgrounds because of the fact that, again, much in the way we do for our ELs, our language learners, we do the same thing for kids who come from low-income backgrounds. We kind of put them in this proverbial box to say that they're underperforming. We constantly lock in on what they don't have, what they can't do. And look, folks who have heard me speak before know I take this one personal because that's how I grew up. That's where I grew up. And I am so proud of where and how I grew up. I would not change a single thing for that, because we had to learn every single day how to survive. We had to learn how to problem solve. We had to learn how to make a way out of no way. And the very students that we frequently say who don't have the intellectual or academic ability to do well because they come from low-income backgrounds are the very students who do those same things every day. They problem solve, right? They figure a way out of no way. They learn how to survive. I need us to see the genius and the gifts and talents that our students from low-income backgrounds possess every single solitary day. So we've got to make sure that we're not seeing a disproportionate number of low-income students who are in our special education programs, a disproportionate number of boys who are in our special education programs, a disproportionate number of language learners in our special education programs, and a disproportionate number of Black students who are in our special education programs. I say that because as I talk to districts across the county, these are the groups that are oftentimes severely overrepresented in ways that may suggest that they are not even diagnosed to have special education or special needs status. So we have to begin to make sure that our equity says, why are these four groups of students being overrepresented in those classifications, okay? So I said I was gonna come back to the issue around Buffalo. And I said I wanted to talk about Buffalo because I think it warrants a conversation for us to have here in Los Angeles. Because while we don't want to see horrific events happen in our city like we saw happen in Buffalo, what I think we do need to be mindful of is that there are tenets of certain beliefs that do permeate that we need to have a conversation about. And that is how we start a conversation around anti-Blackness. And I raise this because one of the things that we must do if we're going to be equity oriented is talk about the very unique ways in which Black children in this county experience something different. But we must have this conversation in a way that does not engage people's white fragility. Because some folks will say, well, why do we have to talk about Black students? There are other students who are not doing well. And I agree with that. I've talked about several of them. But when you look at the data across the board here in our county, when you look at the data across the board in our state, and when you look at the data across the board in our country, who we consistently see at the bottom are Black students. And there are a multitude of factors that explain that, but I want us to begin to at least name the fact that it's something that happens here in LA County and how we need to be intentional and focused on how we do this. We cannot have equity in action if we're not talking about anti-Blackness. Now, there are all kinds of ways we can look at this because folks say, well, Dr. Howard, what's your proof? What's your proof? Well, you know, we could have a data conversation all day and I would win. But anyway, I'm going to say this. We know that over the last couple of years, there's been an increase in hate crimes in our county, in our state. And the group that has had one of the largest spikes in hate crimes has been Asian American students, Asian American people, primarily because of the issues tied to COVID-19. And if you do a deeper dive, even with the spike in the increase of hate crimes around Asian Americans, what the data tells us from a report that came out a couple of years ago from the Attorney General's office, that hate crimes have gone up by 31% in 2020, The 2021 data should be coming out soon. But the primary type of hate crime that we saw in our state was anti-Black bias. So that's why we have to have the conversation about anti-Blackness, anti-Black bias, because it plays out in so many ways. And so that's why we need to understand that though other groups are increasing, there's been an increase, sadly, in anti-Asian hate crime. There's been an increase in the number of anti-LGBTQ hate crimes. There's been an increase in the number of Jewish people who have been targets of hate crime, but they still pale in comparison to the persistent number of reported hate crimes that have been anti-Black. We need to make sure that anti-Black efforts are not being in place in our schools, because if we're not careful, they can be happening right beneath the surface and we're not even paying attention to it. So what does that mean? It means beginning to talk about anti-Blackness. And what is it? It's this whole notion of this deep disdain for Blackness, Black people, Black life. And it begins to sort of cast Blackness. Please be mindful, Blackness as being inhuman, lacking emotion or intellect. Now I noticed that says that anti-Blackness casts Blackness, because I want to be clear here, because I'm talking about Black students on the one hand, but I want to be very clear about the fact that anti-Blackness also manifests itself in other communities of colors as well. What am I talking about? If you look at the work of Victor Rios, he's looked at how anti-Blackness plays itself out in the Latinx communities, where those who are of darker hues are oftentimes assumed to be less intelligent, are more likely to be deemed as pathological and criminalized, despite the fact that they're still Latinx, that darker means worse. You look at the work of Patrick Camagnon, he's unpacked this same notion within with anti-Blackness in Asian American communities, where again, the lighter one is, the more desirable, the more attractive, the more intellectually gifted they are perceived compared to those who are darker hues. So there's this notion of anti-Blackness that permeates across different groups, not just African Americans. It's this notion, again, of seeing Blackness or something that is darker as being bad, that in many ways plays out in our schools right before our eyes. So I go to the data and say, how are some of the ways we see anti-Blackness play out? You look at graduation rates in our state of California. Right prior to the pandemic, we had an all-time high in graduation rates, close to 84%. But what we did not see talked about is that there were subgroups who were not performing at certain levels. If you look at these data, the groups that were not performing at certain levels were who? Black, Latinx, and Native American students. And this probably comes as no surprise, because when you look at the data across schools all throughout this county, the groups that you consistently see at the bottom are Black, Latinx, and Native American, and not too far off are Asian Pacific Islanders. So this is why we have to use data to have these conversations around where we see the inequities exist, have hard conversations around what are the root causes, look at contributing factors and say what can work, what has worked in helping to increase their outcomes. But it's not just academics where we see some aspects of why we see these inequities and why anti-Blackness might be at play. We also look at school discipline. And I always use the biggest district in our county, LAUSD, second largest in the country, though we see some data showing that our numbers are going down. And people have been telling me, well, Dr. Howard, we're suspending fewer and fewer kids. And I say, that's great. And we're doing better, they tell me. But when you do a closer dive at the data, it tells us that something's still not changing. And with that thing that's not changed, if you look at the school enrollment of LAUSD, it's a district that's made about 75%, 74% Latinx. Second largest subgroup are white students at about 10%, followed by Black students about 7-8%, and Asian students about 6%. But when we look at suspensions, it still tells us that though we are suspending fewer students, the racial disparity still exists. And what I will continue to raise is, how do we have Black students who are 7.5% of the population in the district make up over 30% of the students that we are suspending? That's the problem. And there are folks who get mad when I show these data and I say, well, why are you mad at me for sharing your data? If you want to get mad, let's get to the root causes of what causes this and begin to unpack that. That's what we have to do. And much of what is oftentimes talked about is, well, you're making this a racial issue, Dr. Howard. No, it's not a racial issue. This is the data issue that you all report every single year. And I do this with districts all across the county and in the state. And folks say, well, if you fight, if you bite, if you fight, if you kick, if you do things that are harmful, if you bring drugs, if you bring weapons, you got to be suspended. Well, we have data now that tells us that's not the case, that the overwhelming reason why Black kids are suspended is not because of fighting or weapons or drugs. It's primarily because of issues tied to defiance, insubordination, and disrespect. three categories that are highly subjective and oftentimes has a much more detrimental effect on Black students. So if we're gonna do equity, let's start doing a deeper dive at who we're pushing out, who gets second, third, fourth chances, and who's basically on a zero tolerance sort of framework, okay? So again, are these conversations easy? Of course they're not. Are they necessary? Absolutely. Are they gonna make some folks uncomfortable? You bet your bottom dollar. But like I frequently say, if it makes you uncomfortable just having the conversation, if it makes you uncomfortable just looking at the data, how do you think it makes our students feel who experience this every single day? So how do we begin to disrupt and challenge anti-Blackness? I think number one, believe Black students. Black students are bearing their souls out, telling you what they hear, what they see, what they feel, the ways in which they are spoken to in schools. I think we cannot say we're going to be about equity in action if we're not listening to the very students who frequently are on the receiving end of some of the most harsh commentary around. Some of the things that you cannot even begin to wrap your head around when you have students tell you things that they hear from the adults in the buildings, what they hear from school police, what they hear from staff. Listen to Black students, believe them. So many Black students say, if somebody would just listen to what we're saying, you would know that that person should not be teaching children because they say things that are outright racist. Listen to Black students when they begin to speak to the experiences that they encounter. Another thing we can do, advocate for Black students. Oftentimes it's the same people over and over again who are advocating for the students who are most on the margins. It would be much more effective if we had folks who are rarely vocal, but see the inequities if they began to speak up and say, why don't we recommend more of our Black students to AP and honors classes? Why do we have, I was at a school just yesterday. They have a Black population that's about 16%, elementary school, 16%. They didn't have a single Black student in their gifted program, not a one. And when I showed the data, they were like, well, okay, we never thought about that. We never sort of realized that. That's the point. How do you have programs that are designed for kids who are supposedly gifted and talented, and you don't have a single Black student there? This is where we need everyone to kind of speak up, speak out, ask questions about who's present, who's not present, why we see some students constantly being overlooked versus other students who are constantly being provided with opportunities. Another way we can disrupt anti-Blackness is identify and speak about Black excellence. There are Black students who show up in classrooms, who are highly talented, gifted beyond measure, show uncanny genius, and yet they are constantly overlooked and not given opportunities for leadership, extracurricular, not recommended for special programs and opportunities. It's important for us to recognize that excellence is manifested in all of our students. But for some reason, we don't seem to manifest or recognize that their brilliance when it comes to Black students. So again, equity in action says, again, who are the groups that are severely on the margins, but who rarely have an opportunity to be given opportunities, okay? So now, I say that to say, what I frequently hear from folks is, well, you know, Dr. Howard, some kids just have to work harder because they're not working hard enough. If they work hard, opportunities will come. Well, again, I frequently respond to that by saying, stop it, because it's not just about this. If I hear one more person tell me that Black kids, poor kids need to show more grit, I'm going to scream, yell, and because it's not about grit, because you have young people who are showing grit every single solitary day, but they're constantly being told what they don't have. Let us not use the grit excuse for why some kids are not getting an opportunity. Let us not use the grit excuse as to why some kids are not doing well academically. This idea that Angela Duckworth talks about in terms of poor kids in particular is where her focus is, that poor kids need to be taught how to have more grit, to me just blatantly racist, because it assumes that these young people don't have problem solving, they don't have tenacity, they don't know how to persevere. Their lives are full of perseverance. Their lives are full of problem solving. Their lives are full of figuring out a way out of no way. So let's stop the grit argument, because to me, it's classist and it's racist, and it's a way for us not to look at systems and structures that have not served our students well. So recognize that it's not about grit. And if I go one step further, I love this book by Carol Anderson called White Rage. She talks about one of the reasons that we see levels in certain types of anti-Blackness is not just the mere presence of Black students or Black people. She says, rather, it's Blackness with ambition. It's Blackness with drive, with purpose and aspiration that demands that I be treated as an equal. That's what oftentimes upsets lots of folks in schools. And so we need to make sure that when we hear Black students speaking up and speaking out, that they are not being treated differently, because some folks see them, as one teacher told me a couple weeks ago, these Black students here are just so arrogant. And I said, what do you mean by arrogance? She said, they have a comeback for everything that you say. Well, last time I thought, I see affluent white children who speak up and speak out all the time in AP classes, and they're being looked at as individuals who are utilizing their leadership skills, who are using their voice and agency. So why can't Black children and brown children and poor children do the same thing? So let's make sure that they're not being silenced. And let me give you examples of how it plays out and why equity has to be a part of this. So I frequently share this with you before. King, who's 9 years old. King is a bright, brilliant young person who, again, oftentimes gets overlooked in schools. King was given an assignment by his teacher. The assignment was as following. This assignment was, we're going to read, you're going to listen to a story. After you hear the story, tell us what you liked about the story, and then conclude the story, conclude your essay with a burning question and a question of the day, okay? So what you like or dislike about the story and a question of the day. Here's King's essay. He did what he was supposed to do per his teacher's prompt, okay? You may not be able to read that, so I'll help you out. So King says here, today was not a good learning day, blah, blah, blah. I only wanted to hear you not talking. You said something wrong and I can't listen when I hear lies. He said, my mom said that the only Christopher we acknowledge is Wallace, AKA Notorious B.I.G. He says, because Columbus did not find our country, Indians did. I like to have Columbus Day off, but I want you to not teach me lies. That is all. My question for the day is, how can white people teach Black history? King Johnson. Now, again, let me remind you, the prompt was, tell me what you liked about the story you didn't like. King did that. Conclude with a burning question. He has a burning question. But when King did that, his teacher responds by saying, King, I'm very disappointed in your journal today. What did he not do? Why is he disappointed? To which King responds with a simple, okay. That's King's way of saying, well, that's not a me problem, that's a you problem, because I did what I was asked to do. Brilliance, genius amongst our young people that gets manifested every single day, but we have to make sure we have staff in schools that recognize that genius. Here's another way that we see we have to be better when it comes to equity. Let's move away from this no rigor, what's called pedagogy of poverty. Martin Haberman wrote about this decades ago, and I still see it in classrooms to this day. You walk in schools and it's constant giving information, yes, no questions, low-level tasks, busy seat work, going over the test, prepping for the test, talking about the test, teaching to the test, students grading papers. There's no rigor, there's no inspiration, there's no imagination. This is one of the ways we harm kids every single solitary day. We need equity in instruction. And what equity in instruction looks like is when we have a pedagogy of plenty, where young people are able to engage in authentic tasks, meaning-driven curriculum, literacy-rich environments where they can connect home, community with their culture and their interests, problem-focused learning, where they're able to work together with their colleagues, with their students, to be able to solve problems that are of interest to them, where they are able to do what we call meaning-making kind of engagement. I walk into AP classes, I walk into honors class, I see this happening all the time. This should be happening in every classroom. So one of the ways we can think about equity is, do I walk into a classroom and see students talking, or do I constantly see the teacher talking? Because more student talk is typically where there's greater rigor happening, because students learn from each other in powerful ways, as opposed to constantly sitting in schools and classrooms and being lectured at all day. So let's also think about how we can bring that possibility, that pedagogy of poverty, pedagogy of plenty, that's sort of steeped in rigor, depth, and complexity. So let me get ready to wrap up. I got about 5 minutes, and then we're going to do some Q&A. I think it'll take about 4 minutes. So here's some equity strategies for districts. Districts, start letting data drive who is in need. We've got so much data at our fingertips. The data should tell us who needs our support. We need to have a strategic plan of action on racial gaps. Racial gaps have been in place for far too long. Where's our racial strategy that says, here's how we're going to attack and address racial gaps? We have to also begin to destigmatize the mental health and put supports in place and keep those supports in place. They can't just be one-offs, 1 year, 2 year. Mental health matters have to be in place. And then we have to engage with our parents and caregivers. We have to be better at trying to create more welcoming environments for our caregivers. Oftentimes, the reason why caregivers don't show up is because they don't feel welcome, seen, and respected, okay? So those are some districts. Those are some strategies for our districts. For our school leaders, look, our teachers are burnt out. Our teachers are running on fumes. Support your teachers with affirmation. Recognize their commitment, dedication, and sacrifice. Give them more time. Some of our teachers say they spend so much time doing things that are just not important to their job that they feel like they just need time. And create listening sessions. Hear your teachers articulate what they need, because if we did that, we can find better ways to support them. Make sure they get professional learning with relevance. I continue to hear formally and informally teachers who say that we have to sit in PDs that have nothing to do with anything. That's just a waste of our what? Our time. And engage in those courageous conversations. Talk to your staff about what they need. Talk to your staff about the students and caregivers who are oftentimes seen but not heard. And that is oftentimes hard to do, but it starts with leaders. And I maintain you have to celebrate your wins. Play up what you're doing well. The fact that you are even opening your doors up and bringing young people in is a win. The fact that you're seeing attendance rates increase, that's a win. Find the wins, no matter how small they are, and celebrate them. And then lastly, the equity strategies for teachers. Engage your students in what is used by Mark Brackett, what he calls mood meters. Ask your students every single day, if you can, how are they feeling? Because the social emotional well-being of our students, as I mentioned, is suffering. Sometimes the mood meters give you a sense of where your students are every day, and that changes from hour to hour in some cases. Practice patience. We all need to be patient with each other. We're tired, we're overworked, we're overwhelmed, we feel under-supported at times. Practice patience with yourself, practice patience with your students, practice patience with your colleagues, because we're all trying to get through this together. And I maintain that warm demanders are needed. Judith Kleinfeld writes about the fact that warm demanders are these teachers who have a deep-seated love and care and concern for the students, but they never lower the expectations. They never feel sorry for them. They still hold them accountable. They still challenge them. They still have a rigorous curriculum as they continue to express their support and care for their students at the same time. Warm demanders. And I would also ask, practice self-preservation. That is so important in this moment, because again, especially as we get to the end of the academic year, people feel overwhelmed. They feel just at their wits' end. They feel tired. So if you're going to do this equity work, I always tell folks, look, here's the thing. It's going to take time. It's going to take work. It's going to take hustle. The dream is free, but the hustle is sold separately. We're going to have to be able to roll up our sleeves and do the dirty work that nobody else wants to do, find like-minded colleagues, and let's be advocates for our young people. So with that, I'll say, thank you, thank you, thank you. I so appreciate all that you do. I appreciate the work you do investing in our schools, investing in our most cherished possession, our young people. They need you, they need us. So I'll stop it right there and see if we have a little bit of time for Q&A.
Dr. Howard, I see one question, and it's related to actually your presentation. Is there a version of this training that we can use in our classroom as a way to bring awareness to our students about the services that are available to them, as opposed to what is just offered to them?
Ooh, that's a great question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we've got the speaker series. Look, there's been times where I've even come in to talk to students directly, because I think we need to have real talk with students. I was in an elementary school yesterday with some elementary students talking about racism and this Buffalo situation that was powerful. And these were second graders, folks, who were just unbelievable. And I think we sleep on our kids and their genius, thinking that they can't have these conversations, but they are beyond brilliant in ways that we can't imagine. So I'm gonna have to defer to you on that one, Jewel, if there are other ways we can think about doing that.
I think that there's so many possibilities, and I would love to brainstorm with you around this. I love student voice, but I also love connecting with teachers in the classroom.
Mm-hmm.
So let's make it happen.
Yes, let's make it happen. Let's talk.
I realize that we have a couple of other questions in the chat. Janice, I'll defer to you because I know we are at time. I can record the questions and then we can respond at a later date.
I think if you want to ask one more question and then we'll close out, I think that would work today.
Okay, great. So we'll do one more question. How do you deal with a district or school that has fear in having conversations about race and it says and ability?
Yeah, you got to have a one-on-one conversation with your leader. That needs to start at the top. Leaders have to lead. Leaders have to be fearless. Leaders have to be courageous. And the leader doesn't have the willingness to have the conversation. You're like at ground. You can't start from the word go. And that's the sad part. So that's why I do a lot of work with leaders. Like, you've got to be willing to stand in the discomfort of these conversations. And if your leaders are not willing to do that, then you've got to be willing to sort of talk to other like-minded folks and say, we're going to take on a leadership role ourselves. And we're going to start the conversation at staff meetings. And we're going to push the envelope, even though our leaders may not want to have it. And many of you are already doing that. And that's the thing that I so admire about a lot of our teacher leaders. They're saying, why should we sit back and wait for somebody who doesn't want to lead? And they take the steps that are necessary. And do they ruffle feathers? Yes, they do. But like I said at the outset, there are some feathers that need to be ruffled. Are they going to upset some folks? Yes, but some folks need to be upset, because you're upset. Maybe that moves us into action. So we just cannot continue to kind of use the status quo anymore and see too many of our young people falling in the cracks, because that is just not good for us as a county. It's not good for us as a state. It really is not good for the nation when you think about it, because we're the largest growing population, Black and brown students, and yet there's some of the student groups who are most underserved. We got to start pushing these conversations.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Howard, for inspiring us today. What we can do is we can take the remainder of the questions. Maybe we can just send those out to you, and we can upload those questions and answers on Canvas. So tomorrow you will get a link to Canvas where you will be able to access the study guides and four additional videos from Dr. Tyrone Howard. Thank you to everyone today for joining us for Series 8 of Safe and Welcoming Schools. And at this time, I would like to turn it over to our technology department to sign us off.
Thank you for joining us. At this time, the webinar has concluded. You may disconnect.